Hey guys, before we get into tonight's stories, I just want to give a quick warning. The stories in this video are disturbing, so you guys are definitely in for a treat tonight. But seriously, some of these stories include violent situations, blood, and some details that might make some people uncomfortable. So if that kind of stuff isn't for you, or you're sensitive to intense content, this might be a good video to skip. With that said, lock your doors, turn the lights down, and let's get into it. I'm Amber. I was around 17. It was during that weird period where everybody I knew was either finishing high school or pretending they were already adults. I'm 31 now, and I still think about it. I grew up kind of outside Pittsburgh, but not close enough where people would actually say Pittsburgh. Everybody worked normal jobs, people knew each other's parents. My friends and I mostly just looked for places away from adults, honestly. That was basically the whole goal at that age. There was this wooded area outside town. People would have bonfires there sometimes. You'd find beer cans and broken folding chairs out there all the time. Older kids went there before us too. It was just known. If somebody said there was a party in the woods, that's probably where it was. The weird thing is, I almost didn't even go that night because I had work early the next morning at this store where I bagged groceries and stocked shelves sometimes. I hated that job so much. The manager was this guy who acted like stocking soup cans was military service or something. I remember I was already irritated because he changed my shift last minute that week, and I was supposed to open in the morning. But one of my friends, Sydney, kept texting me saying everybody was going and I never came out anymore. Which honestly was kind of true. I had started staying home more around then because my parents were fighting a lot, and weirdly it made me tired all the time. I know that doesn't really make sense, but it did. Being around people yelling every day drains you after a while. So I said fine and drove over there around 9:30 at night. There were around 15 people there total when I arrived. Not a huge party, mostly people from nearby schools. Some I knew, some I didn't. Everybody was standing around this fire pit, somebody made out of rocks. The woods themselves weren't super dense right there. You could still see the dirt trail and the tree line opened up near the creek farther down. During the day, it honestly wasn't scary there at all. Kids used to walk around there fishing and stuff. For a while, people drinking, talking loud, smoking, throwing stuff into the fire for no reason. I wasn't even drinking much because of work the next morning. I had like half a beer over like an hour because I was paranoid my mom would somehow know. She had this thing where she'd smell my clothes when I came home sometimes. Looking back, that's not normal either, but whatever. At some point, more people showed up and the whole vibe got louder. There was this guy there named Trail Dan who kept trying to jump over the fire, and everybody was recording him because back then everybody thought filming stupid stuff automatically made it funny. One girl almost threw up in somebody's car. Then this older guy showed up. I say older, but he was like only late 30s or early 40s now that I think about it. Back then, anybody over 25 looked old to me. I didn't see where he came from. That part's always bothered me, because one second everybody was talking, and then suddenly this guy was standing near the edge of the firelight. He wasn't dressed weird. He honestly looked like somebody's dad. That's probably part of why nobody immediately freaked out. If he looked crazy, people probably would have reacted differently. At first, everybody thought maybe he owned the property nearby. He walked closer and said, "You kids need to get out of here." He was calm. Dan started laughing because Trail Dan laughed at everything back then and said, "Okay, Dad." Some people laughed. The guy didn't. I remember seeing his face looked wet. Then he said there were cops coming because neighbors called about noise. Again, calm, like weirdly calm. He kept glancing off toward the trees while talking too. Not directly at us much. That part actually did scare people because cops came out there before sometimes. Nobody wanted underage drinking tickets, or parents called, so people started grabbing their stuff pretty fast. I remember Sydney asking if we should just leave entirely, but somebody else said there was another spot farther down by the creek where people hung out sometimes, less visible from the road. So instead of everybody leaving, a smaller group of us just walked farther through the woods. Looking back, that was obviously stupid. But at that age, if somebody tells you cops are coming, you just move locations and keep hanging out. That's literally all we thought about. There were 7 of us that walked down there together. Me, Sydney, Trail Dan, and others. Everybody had phones, obviously, but reception out there sucked, especially near the creek. The walk down there took like 10 minutes. The trail got narrower and muddier the farther we went. I remember somebody almost twisting an ankle because there were roots everywhere under the leaves. You could hear the water before you saw it. The creek itself wasn't huge. It's a wide stream. Water moved pretty fast though, because there'd been rain earlier that week. There were big rocks sticking out everywhere, and these fallen trees crossing parts of it. We hung out there for a while, and honestly after a bit, everybody forgot about the older guy. People started joking again. Trail Dan kept throwing rocks into the water, trying to hit branches floating downstream. Sydney was sitting beside me, talking about this guy she liked from another school. Nothing felt wrong. There wasn't some huge warning sign, no moment where everything suddenly got scary. It was just normal until it absolutely wasn't. At one point I walked a little farther down the creek by myself because I needed to pee, honestly. I didn't go far. I could still hear everybody talking behind me. I remember the water sounded louder away from the group. Like once their voices got quieter, the creek noise took over everything. It was cold too near the water. Afterward, I stayed there for another minute because I was texting somebody and trying to get service. My phone kept going between one bar and none, and then I heard footsteps behind me. I thought it was Sydney. I actually started turning around while saying something like, "There's no signal down here either." But it was that same man. I remember freezing immediately because it made no sense. I didn't hear him walking up through the leaves or anything before that. He was just there, close enough where I could smell this weird, damp smell coming off his clothes. He looked different up close. He grabbed the back of my hoodie. I thought he was trying to scare me or drag me away from the creek edge because it was slippery there. My brain didn't immediately go to danger. Well, that's stupid. Then he shoved me forward hard. I fell onto my knees near the edge of the water, and before I could even react, he pushed my head down toward the creek. I remember the shock more than pain. The water was freezing cold and hit my face so hard I inhaled some immediately. I couldn't even process what was happening. I just remember hearing the water rushing insanely loud in my ears while he held the back of my neck. I started screaming, but my mouth kept hitting water. He kept pushing my head down harder. I was clawing at rocks trying to pull myself up, and I remember my hands slipping because everything was muddy there. This guy was trying to drown me, like fully seriously, trying to unalive me, and that thought felt so insane. I managed to twist sideways enough to get one arm loose, and I screamed louder, really loud. The guy jerked me backward away from the creek, and I hit the ground. My shoulder slammed into a rock. I looked up and saw him pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was a knife, dark handle, silver blade. Once I saw it, something in me finally fully understood. This wasn't some weird misunderstanding anymore. He grabbed my arm and tried pulling me up off the ground. I started screaming again and trying to yank backward, but I was slipping everywhere because the mud near the creek bank was soaked. I remember my jeans getting completely filthy almost instantly. The guy kept saying something while he pulled me, but I honestly couldn't understand most of it. I only clearly remember him saying, "Stop fighting," at one point. Then he swung the knife at me. One caught the sleeve of my hoodie and sliced it open near my wrist. Another one hit my shoulder area, I think, but not deep. I mostly felt pressure more than pain right away. I started kicking at him and somehow managed to twist enough where he lost his grip for a second. That's when the others heard me. I heard Trail Dan yelling. Suddenly, there were footsteps crashing through leaves behind us, and the guy turned around really fast, like he didn't expect anybody else to come. Everything after that honestly gets messy in my memory because it happened so fast. Trail Dan reached us first and shoved the guy away from me hard enough both of them almost fell into the creek. The guy with the knife immediately swung toward Trail Dan and caught him across the arm. Trail Dan screamed and stumbled backward holding his forearm. I still remember seeing blood on his hand even in the dark. Not insane gore, but enough, you know. Adam tried grabbing the guy from behind and they both went down near the rocks by the water. The knife dropped for a second. I remember hearing metal hit stone. For a second, I thought they had him. Then the guy somehow got loose again and picked the knife back up before anybody else could. Matt ran in to help and got slashed across the side of his leg, trying to kick the knife away. Everybody was yelling over each other at that point. Just chaos. Water splashing everywhere, somebody screaming to call 911 over and over. The guy looked completely different then than when he first showed up at the fire earlier. I don't know how to explain it. Then he just ran. It happened so suddenly. 1 second, everybody was fighting with him, and then he shoved Adam sideways into the creek and sprinted straight into the trees. And it was dark out there. Once he got past the creek area, you could barely see anything. Trail Dan tried to go after him for 2 seconds before everybody started yelling that he was bleeding too much. So we stopped. I remember sitting against this tree shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. At first, I thought it was because of the creek water, but I think it was shock. My whole hoodie was soaked and muddy, and my hands were scraped up from the rocks. Sydney kept grabbing my face asking if I was okay, and I couldn't answer her properly because I couldn't stop coughing water up. Matt was sitting on the ground holding his leg. Trail Dan's arm was bleeding the worst though. The cut wasn't massive, but it was deep enough where blood kept running down onto his hand. Adam finally got enough phone signal to call 911. Dispatch kept asking where we were exactly, and none of us knew how to explain it. The cops and ambulance took forever getting there too. It felt insanely long. Once police got there, everything started feeling weirdly embarrassing. That sounds terrible considering what happened, but it's true. I think because suddenly adults were there, and we were all drunk teenagers in the woods, bleeding everywhere trying to explain ourselves. The paramedics checked me first because I was soaked and coughing so much. They thought I might have inhaled too much water. Then they worked on Trail Dan and Matt. Both of them ended up going to the hospital, mainly because of the knife cuts. Matt got stitches in his leg, and Trail Dan had nerve damage in part of his arm for a while after. He recovered mostly, though. The police kept separating us and asking us the same questions. I remembered his jacket being wet. I remembered his hand on the back of my neck. I remembered the smell. But actual details about his face felt blurry already, which made me feel horrible because I thought if I couldn't describe him, then maybe they'd never find him. They searched the woods that entire night, apparently. My parents had to come pick me up from the hospital after they checked me out. That car ride home was awful. My mom kept crying. My dad was furious, mostly because I was drinking in the woods to begin with. He started yelling about that at first until my mom screamed at him to shut up because I almost got unalived. The cops never caught the guy. When I was a kid, me and my friend Sean spent basically every day outside during summers. This was around 2008 or 2009. Sean was a year older than me and lived nearby. Our town honestly wasn't exciting at all. Most adults worked at either the paper mill outside town or commuted like 40 minutes south. Everybody knew everybody's business. If you rode your bike too fast past someone's yard, your mom somehow heard about it before dinner. So me and Sean were always trying to find stuff to do because there wasn't much. We'd walk railroad tracks, mess around near the creek behind the football field, look for old beer bottles in the woods, stuff like that. There was this abandoned house, like older kids used it as a place to smoke or drink. It sat way back behind this dead-end road near the edge of our neighborhood where the pavement eventually turned to dirt. You couldn't see the house unless you already knew where it was because the trees covered most of it. I think at one point it had belonged to an older couple years before we were born, but by the time we knew about it, the place had already been empty forever. Nobody really cared about it. We were sitting outside the convenience store eating those cheap frozen slushies they had, and he goes, "You ever actually been inside that house?" And I said no, because honestly I was kind of nervous about getting caught trespassing. But Sean was one of those kids that always acted fearless, even when he definitely wasn't. He'd laugh at everything. Even when something scared him, he'd pretend it didn't. So for like a week, he kept talking about going there. He heard from some high school kids that there was weird stuff inside, graffiti everywhere, dead animals. At that age, that sounded insane to us. It was probably just older kids making things up, because that's what older kids do. The day we actually went out there was August. School was starting soon, and my mom kept bothering me about sleeping schedule stuff. Sean came over around 4 or 5 with his bike and asked if I wanted to go. I almost said no, because I had this weird bad feeling for no reason. We biked down the neighborhood roads and left the bikes near the woods because there wasn't really a trail for them after that. I remember Sean brought this flashlight even though it was still daytime. He kept smacking it against his hand because it flickered on and off. We walked like 15 minutes through trees before we saw the house. The place looked worse. That's the thing I remember strongest now, actually. Just how dead it looked. The siding had turned almost gray from weather, and half the porch leaned downward like it was sinking into the ground. There were broken branches all over the yard and weeds taller than us near one side of the house. No cars anywhere. It felt weirdly quiet back there compared to the neighborhood. Sean still acted excited though. He was like smiling almost. We went through the front door because it was hanging halfway open already. Inside smelled horrible. The floor creaked bad enough that we stepped carefully at first because honestly it felt like parts could collapse. There was junk everywhere. Random clothes on the floor that looked damp somehow even though the place was dry. I remember there was graffiti all over one wall in spray paint, but most of it was stupid stuff. Swear words, band names, random drawings. Somebody had smashed holes into parts of the drywall too. Sean kept poking around everything while I mostly stayed near him because the whole place made me uncomfortable. Upstairs was mostly empty rooms. One room had an old mattress with stains all over it. Another had piles of magazines scattered around. I remember seeing a dead raccoon near one doorway upstairs, and it scared the hell out of me because I almost stepped on it. It looked old already, fur missing in places. Sean laughed at me for jumping, but even he stopped smiling after that. I kept getting this feeling somebody had been there recently though. Not because the house looked lived in. It didn't. But little things felt off. Like one room downstairs had empty water bottles that didn't look old. There was a flashlight sitting on a windowsill that actually worked when Sean tested it. Stuff like that. Sean said homeless people came through. The basement door was near the kitchen. At first, we actually missed it because junk was piled around it. Sean noticed it when he moved some broken chair pieces out of the way. The door itself looked newer than everything else somehow. Not brand new, obviously, but less rotted than the rest of the house. I didn't want to go down there. I remember saying that right away. Sean said, "Dude, we already came this far. You don't want to look scared in front of your friend." So we went down. The basement smelled different, colder too. There were concrete walls and exposed beams overhead and barely any light besides what came through the top stairs. Sean used the flashlight because it got dark down there. There was weird stuff everywhere, like homemade-looking things, candles melted onto the floor, strange symbols painted on pieces of wood, jars with some stuff. I remember a lot of animal bones too, but small ones. At the time though, it freaked us out because we were kids and our brains immediately went to cults and serial killers and all that garbage. Sean stopped joking around after we saw all that. The basement itself wasn't huge. It's like 2 separate areas connected together. One side had shelves and old tools. The other side looked almost cleaned out except for all the weird stuff scattered around. I remember there was a folding chair facing one wall for some reason. Sean saw the hole. I thought it was just part of the foundation broken open, but it looked dug out intentionally, like somebody had literally carved into the dirt underneath the basement wall. The opening wasn't massive, but definitely big enough for a person to crawl through. Dirt piled around the edges, scratch marks everywhere. The flashlight barely showed anything past the entrance because it curved downward. I still remember standing there trying to understand what I was looking at. Because it wasn't just a hole. It looked used. The dirt inside looked packed down almost smooth in places, like something had gone in and out over and over again. There was this smell coming from it too. Sean crouched near it and pointed the flashlight deeper inside. I told him not to go near it, but he ignored me. Then he goes really quietly, "I think there's blankets down there." I moved closer, and yeah, there was definitely fabric deeper inside. Maybe bags too. Suddenly the whole thing stopped feeling like abandoned kid adventure stuff and started feeling real, like somebody actually stayed there. I remember saying we should leave right then. Sean nodded immediately, which honestly scared me worse because usually he argued about everything. He stood up fast and backed away from the hole. We heard something moving underneath us, not in the basement itself, from inside the dirt tunnel. At first it sounded almost like scraping, getting closer. Sean pointed the flashlight toward the opening again, and I swear I remember hearing breathing too. Really rough breathing, the kind where somebody sounds exhausted or sick. Then this man crawled halfway out of the hole. Even now, I still hate thinking about how he looked because my memory makes it weird sometimes. For years I convinced myself he looked like some kind of creature or something not human, but honestly I think that's just because I was young and terrified out of my mind. Looking back, I think he was human. Just looked wrong. His skin looked pale gray in the flashlight. His hair was long and greasy and hanging over his face. Dirt covered his arms and clothes. I remember his eyes most though, just wide open in this really intense way, like he hadn't expected us either. Like an animal getting cornered. He suddenly lunged forward out of the hole so fast, Sean dropped the flashlight and it rolled across the floor, and the guy started screaming. This horrible screaming sound while scrambling toward us on his hands and knees before standing up crooked like something hurt his back or leg or something. I remember Sean yelling my name, but it didn't even sound like his normal voice anymore. It cracked really bad, like he was crying already. The flashlight spun across the floor, pointing in random directions, and every time the light hit the guy properly, I caught another piece of him. Dirt all over his mouth. His shirt hanging open. Shoe missing. I honestly think that's part of why it stuck with me so bad after, because none of it looked fake or ghost-like or anything. It looked real. Too real. We ran for the stairs. The guy came after us fast, but weirdly uneven, like he couldn't fully stand right. I remember hearing his hands slapping the concrete at first, before he got upright. Sean got to the basement stairs before me, and almost slipped because the wood steps were half broken already. I was right behind him, and I swear I felt something brush the back of my shirt near the top. I don't remember getting through the kitchen. That whole part feels blurred out in my head even now. I just remember us running through the front doorway so hard, Sean hit his shoulder against it and stumbled into the weeds outside. The second we got into daylight, it somehow became scarier because now I could see the woods around the house moving from wind. The guy came out of the house. He stopped on the porch at first. He didn't chase us immediately. He stood there breathing hard, watching us. I remember him squinting because of the sunlight through the trees. His face looked older than I first thought in the basement. Not elderly. I mean like 40s, but rough looking, like somebody who'd lived outside a long time. His beard was patchy and dirty, and his eyes looked almost swollen around the edges. Sean screamed, "Run," again, and we took off. We didn't even go toward our bikes at first. We bolted through the woods, completely panicked. I lost one of my shoes for a second in mud and almost fell trying to keep up. Sean was ahead of me, crashing through bushes, and I remember hearing him breathing hard. I kept expecting hands grabbing me from behind, and the guy was chasing us. I know he was. I heard him crashing through the woods behind us more than once, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. At one point I looked back and saw him between trees. I still remember how strange he moved, like somebody starving. He kept stumbling, but never stopped coming. We finally reached the dirt road near the neighborhood, and that's where things got really confusing. Because once we got closer to actual houses and backyards and stuff, the guy suddenly disappeared. We got our bikes, and even then, our hands were shaking. We rode all the way back through the neighborhood. When we finally stopped, it was near the basketball courts behind the elementary school, because that was the first place with other people around. I remember this little kid was riding a scooter nearby and staring at us like we were crazy. Sean bent over with his hands on his knees and kept saying, "What the hell was that?" I didn't even answer because I had no idea. Part of me wanted to say it was just some homeless guy living under the house, but another part of me couldn't explain the tunnel or the screaming or why he chased us through the woods like that. Neither of us told our parents the truth. Why didn't you tell somebody? Honestly, because we were kids and scared of getting in trouble. We weren't supposed to be back there, plus trying to explain the whole thing. Good luck with that. I grew up in Pennsylvania, where if somebody screamed outside at night, nobody besides maybe the closest neighbor would hear it. And even then, they probably wouldn't know where it came from. Our house sat behind this dirt lane off a county road, and behind the house there was just woods for miles. I remember what school teacher I had at the time, and I remember my brother still being in middle school before he started football, so it had to be around then. My memory's weird with dates, though. I remember random stuff way better than actual years. The house, my parents bought it cheap because my dad worked for the township and we didn't have a lot of money. It had this huge backyard that kind of sloped downward until it hit the tree line. My dad cut the grass himself with this loud riding mower that constantly broke down. So parts of the yard always looked uneven because he'd fix one section and ignore another. There was an old swing set back there too that my brother and I barely used by then because we were getting older, but my mom never wanted to get rid of it. I spent a lot of time outside when I was younger, mostly because my parents didn't like us sitting inside all day. My mom especially had this thing where she'd tell us, "Go outside and figure something out." So I'd walk around the yard, collect random junk, ride my bike up and down the driveway, stuff like that. We didn't really have neighbors close enough to casually hang out with, so you kind of learned how to entertain yourself. I remember the woods behind our house because I used to hate going too close to them even before all this happened. During the daytime they were fine, but around evening they got dark. The trees were packed together, and there were these weird dips in the ground from old runoff areas, and sometimes you'd hear branches back there. My dad hunted, so he always acted like I was dramatic for being nervous about the woods. But when you're a kid and you're standing alone in a huge backyard and there's this giant stretch of forest behind you, your brain starts making things worse than they probably are. It was summer, school had either just started again or was about to. I remember there being those little bugs everywhere, the ones that smack into window screens at night. My mom had grocery bags on the kitchen counter and was making spaghetti because she made spaghetti all the time when my dad worked late. My brother was at a friend's house for most of the afternoon, so I was alone outside for a while. I had one of those plastic cameras from Walmart because for some reason I got obsessed with taking pictures of random stuff back then. Mostly trees and bugs and things like that. I'd probably taken 20 pictures of absolutely nothing important that day already. I remember walking near the back edge of the yard because there were blackberries growing near the trees. Tiny sour ones. But I used to pick them anyway. The grass back there was taller because my dad hated mowing near the woods since the mower would get stuck sometimes. And I remember hearing somebody cough. It made me turn around immediately. It was this guy standing like 20 feet away near the edge of the woods. I can still picture him weirdly clearly, honestly. He wasn't old, but not young either. Maybe 40s. Beard. Thin. I remember the jacket because it looked dirty, like it had stains on the sleeves. He also had this baseball cap on, dark blue, and he kept one hand in his pocket almost the entire time. I thought he was lost. We had hikers sometimes in the general area because there were trails farther out beyond the woods. He smiled at me when I turned around, but he was weird, like he smiled too fast. He goes, "Hey there." I didn't answer. Then he asked if my parents were home. I remember that. My stomach dropped when he said it. Even as a kid, I knew not to tell strangers when you were alone. Schools drilled that into you constantly back then. So I shrugged and said, "I don't know," which obviously made no sense because it was my house, but I was nervous and trying not to say anything. The guy kind of laughed quietly after I said that, like he was humoring me. He took a couple steps closer too. He asked if we had a phone he could use because his truck broke down nearby. That part could have been true, honestly. There were trucks breaking down on those roads all the time. But something about him felt wrong. I don't even know if I can explain why. He wasn't yelling or acting crazy. It was more the way he kept looking past me toward the house instead of really talking to me directly. I remember backing up. Then he asked my name. That's when I just turned around and started walking toward the house. He called after me asking if my dad was home again. I ignored him. I remember hearing him walking for a second too, which made my chest tighten up really bad. But then it stopped. I got inside through the back door and locked it. My mom was in the kitchen and asked why I came in so fast. I told her there was a man outside near the woods asking weird questions. I expected her to panic or something, but honestly, at first, she didn't seem super alarmed. Probably because random people occasionally showed up asking for directions around there. She walked over to the sink window to look outside, but by then, he was gone. My mom asked what he looked like, and I explained the jacket and hat and stuff. She told me I did the right thing coming inside, and then she locked the mudroom door too. Nobody thought attempted kidnapping or anything dramatic right away. It just felt unsettling. My dad got home around dinner time, and my mom mentioned it while we were eating. He kept asking exactly where the guy came from and whether there was a vehicle nearby. After dinner, my dad walked the edge of the woods for a while carrying a flashlight. He did that kind of thing a lot. Very handle-it-yourself type person. When he came back, he said he didn't see anybody. I remember him saying it was some drunk guy wandering around. The thing about our house is my bedroom was on the first floor. My parents' room was upstairs because part of the upstairs had slanted ceilings, and they gave me the downstairs room since it was bigger. At the time, I loved it because I felt older having my own room separate from everyone else. After this happened, I hated it. My room faced the backyard. There was one big window right beside my bed. We didn't have curtains. It's like those thin blinds that never fully closed, right? That night, I stayed up reading one of those old Goosebumps books. My brother was already asleep. My parents usually stayed awake upstairs watching TV for another hour or so after I went to bed. I don't know exactly what time it was when I heard the first knock. I remember sitting up slowly in bed. Outside the window, it was basically pitch black. We didn't have backyard lights. Then this voice says quietly, "Hey." I swear my whole body locked up. I couldn't even breathe. The voice was calm, like whispering, and I recognized it. Same guy from earlier. I rolled off the bed, hit my knee on the floor. The pain felt weirdly sharp, but I barely reacted to it. Then I heard him knock harder against the glass. And then the blinds moved, like somebody was pushing on the window from outside. I started screaming. I remember backing into my dresser and hearing stuff fall off it, while the guy outside started pushing harder against the window. The window rattled really bad. That's the part I remember the clearest even now. The glass shaking in the frame while somebody on the other side kept trying to shove it upward. It was one of those older windows that slid up and down, and I guess he thought it wasn't locked. Then I heard my dad upstairs yelling, asking what happened. The guy outside stopped talking completely after that, but I could still hear movement right outside the window. My bedroom door flew open a second later, and my dad came in so fast he almost slammed into the wall. I remember him looking more confused than scared at first, until I pointed toward the window and could barely get words out. I said, the man from outside earlier." My mom came downstairs behind him and turned the light on. The blinds were bent weirdly where somebody had shoved against them from outside. One side had partially snapped loose. My dad went straight to the window and looked out, but whoever it was had already moved away from it. Then he ran toward the back door so fast I heard dishes rattle in the kitchen when he shoved it open. I followed my mom into the living room because she grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me away from the bedroom. I remember she asking if I was okay, but she sounded distracted, listening for my dad outside. We heard him yelling, angry shouting from somewhere in the backyard. My mom went pale, like instantly. She told me to stay inside and she ran toward the mudroom door. I followed because I was a kid and completely panicking at that point. I could see outside through the back screen door. The porch light barely reached the yard, but farther back near the tree line I could see my dad running with a flashlight. The beam was bouncing everywhere because he was moving fast. I remember hearing branches snapping too. Then my dad yelled, "Stop right there!" After that, there was crashing sounds in the woods, heavy footsteps, somebody running through brush. My mom grabbed the phone from the kitchen wall and called 911. We still had a landline back then because cell service around our house sucked. I remember her trying to explain everything quickly while looking out the window every couple seconds. The weird thing is I don't remember crying much during it. I think I was too scared for that. My whole body just felt numb and shaky at the same time. A sheriff deputy showed up first because we lived outside town limits. My dad came back inside before the second deputy got there. He was sweating like crazy and breathing hard. He said he chased the guy into the woods but lost him near this creek area behind our property. I remember my dad looked genuinely rattled for the first time in my life. Usually nothing scared him. Even after car accidents or storms or whatever, he stayed calm. But that night he kept pacing around the kitchen while talking to the deputies. They asked me questions eventually. Mostly the same ones over and over. They found footprints in the dirt. They also found marks under the window like somebody had been trying to force it upward from the outside. I remember hearing the deputy quietly tell my parents he probably watched the house first. That sentence messed me up for a long time after. They drove slowly around the roads nearby afterward looking for the guy, but apparently never found anybody. No vehicle either. They asked if there were any hunting cabins or camps deeper in the woods because sometimes people stayed out there illegally. My dad said there used to be an old shack farther back years earlier, but he thought it collapsed. After the police left, my parents didn't let me sleep alone. I slept upstairs on the floor in their room for almost 2 weeks after that. And honestly, for a little while, things got weird around our house after that. Everybody stayed nervous. Our dog started barking at night more. Suddenly he'd stand near the back door, growling at random times after dark. I think the worst part was not knowing who the guy actually was. If it had been some drunk neighbor or somebody mentally ill from nearby, at least there would have been an explanation. But nobody around town seemed to know anything. The deputies even showed my parents this binder of local offenders and transients at one point, which I probably wasn't supposed to see, but none of the pictures matched him. The guy smelled strange when he talked to me in the yard earlier that day.